This is the Performance People podcast, brought to you by our new brand, Ainsley & Ainsley, giving you the sleep, rest and recovery you need when you need it most with our new night powder supplement. Shake and take 1 to 2 hours before bed, sleep like an athlete and wake up different. Now on the pod this week, Ed Jackson, a former professional rugby player who was defined by his physicality and performance on the field of play. But in 2017, at a family friend's barbecue, an accident ended his old life forever. He dived into a swimming pool, not realising it was 3 feet deep. On the way to hospital, he had to be resuscitated 3 times. Not long after, he was told he'd never walk again. Incredibly, just 3 years later, Ed was standing on the world's highest trekking peak. Now, as co-founder of the Millimetres to Mountains Foundation, he says he no longer regrets the accident that led him here.
And they had a feature pool with a waterfall in one end, and I thought it was deep. Turned out it wasn't. The journey to hospital was supposed to take 15 minutes, ended up taking 2.5 hours because they kept having to pull over and resuscitate me, which, you know, in hindsight puts a different spin on how fortunate I am to be here.
I imagine it was just extreme shock when the doctors tell you this is your prognosis.
It's funny thinking back how the bar shifts, how a wiggling toe can be the greatest thing you've ever experienced in terms of emotions. So when I was in a good headspace, I would see positive recovery in my neurology. This is getting now proven in the science. The community, the sense of purpose, the paying the help forward that I received, that's what's really been the sort of healing thing for me.
Has this given you your identity back?
You know, what we've done with the charity means that I do not regret my accident at all.
So Ed, we always start these podcasts by talking about somebody's moment in time. And that could be any manner of things. But I guess with you, it's pretty obvious what that moment in time was. And we cast our minds back to 2017. I'm not going to tell your story because I don't know how to, but it would be great to hear from you what happened that did effectively change everything.
Yeah, so, I mean, I kind of feel like I've lived 2 lives up until this point, or I'm living my second life, because my previous life was as a professional rugby player. So I did that for 10 years, and that was obviously dream come true for a boy from the West Country. But the moment you're talking about, of course, is in 2017. I was recovering from a shoulder injury 10 years into my career. And I went to a family friend's for a barbecue, and they had a feature pool with a waterfall in one end. And I thought it was deep. Turned out it wasn't. Just, you know, it was one of those split-second decisions. Didn't even have to consider. It wasn't like, okay, this is a waterfall in a river. I'll go and check if it's deep or not. It just seemed so obvious. But I was wrong. So what I thought was 7 feet, 6-7 feet deep, turned out to be 3 feet deep. And I dived in head first and hit my head so hard on the bottom of the pool that I dislocated the bottom of my neck. The disc in between the C6 and C7 vertebrae exploded and lodged into my spinal cord, and I was completely paralyzed, like instantly from the shoulders down, which of course was not ideal being in a swimming pool at the time, because you know, that it was first of all just sort of, I mean, I didn't lose consciousness, which surprised me considering how hard I hit my head. I've definitely been knocked out on the rugby pitch a few more times from less of an impact, but I couldn't move. So I quite quickly started panicking and whether I would drown. Fortunately, my dad was there. One of my friends was there. They pulled me to the surface, and what transpired over the next sort of a few hours was I was rushed to hospital. I actually had to be resuscitated 3 times in the ambulance, which I can't really remember much of. I just felt a bit drowsy. So there were no pearly gates for me or panic or anything like that. It was actually quite relaxing. I just felt like I was going to sleep. And I didn't find out till a year later, actually, that had happened, because the journey to hospital was supposed to take 15 minutes, ended up taking 2.5 hours because they kept having to pull over and resuscitate me, which, you know, in hindsight puts a different spin on how fortunate I am to be here. And probably does have an impact on the way I view my life now. But I was rushed to hospital. Fortunately, I was near Southmead Hospital in Bristol, which is sort of a really leading neurological centre, and an amazing surgeon called Mr. Neil Brewer operated on me, 7-hour operation, and I woke up in intensive care. However, I woke up in intensive care and I'd made no recovery, so I was still completely paralysed from the shoulders down. And, that I entered a very, very dark, scary period of my life. I think up until that point, it was shock. And then you wake up, and over the coming days, you kind of realize the situation or the gravity of the situation. And actually, after 7 days, I was told by the surgeon that I had a complete spinal cord injury, and they were hoping for some use of my arms and hands back, but they weren't expecting any use below that, so wouldn't be walking again. Fortunately, obviously, as we'll get onto, that wasn't the case. It turned out I was in severe spinal shock, and I've ended up 2 days later. My toe flicked, and bit by bit, my body started coming back to me. Over the course of 4 months in hospital, I stood for the first time. 9 months, I sort of was. I managed to. 4 months I left hospital. After 9 months, sort of got rid of the wheelchair and was walking with sticks and poles. 12 months, I climbed Snowdon for charity. And then I've just been sort of going higher and higher and further ever since. I still live with a spinal cord injury. I have something called Brown-Séquard syndrome. So my spinal cord was actually cut in half, like vertically. So what was 12 millimeters wide is now 6 millimeters wide. And without getting too technical, the side that I cut on the left, that cut the motor nerves to the left-hand side of my body, but the sensory nerves to the right, because they come out the opposite side of your outside of your brain. So I have no sensation down my right side, but it moves well. I've got good sensation down my left side, but it doesn't move well at all. I'm what's called an incomplete quadriplegic, so my arms and legs are affected. So I limp around with foot splints and stuff, but I mean, I'm so much further down the line than I ever thought I would be. I do consider myself very fortunate, to be honest.
And you talk about this now with such fluidity and lucidity, and it feels like you're very much, you've come to terms with what's happened. But in those really early days, I imagine it was just extreme shock when the doctors tell you this is your prognosis and this is what's most likely to happen. You're hearing that from very educated people who've seen these things many times before. What did it feel like on that day when your toe flicked? Because that must have given you almost a moment of, well, hang on a second, maybe they're not right. Maybe I can do something different here.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I was delivered that news, I think it wasn't a surprise because I'm not stupid. I'd had ASIA tests every day, which is American Spinal Injury Assessment. They check your temperature, your movement, they put electrodes on you, and there was no signals coming through below my level of injury. So when they came to give me the prognosis after 7 days, I kind of knew what was coming, but for it to be verbalized is obviously still a very hard thing to hear. It is like being punched in the stomach. But I did have a very immediate strange reaction to that because it was the words, independence. He said, we're hoping to get the use of your arm back so you can be independent. And at that point, I realized that this isn't just about me. It's about anyone that's going to have to look after me for the rest of my life. And I knew, as I lay there and looked at my then fiance, now wife, and my mum, that I needed to do everything I could to try and get better. Not because I was going to get better, because as you rightfully pointed out, I've just been told by a leading neurosurgeon who saved my life that it's not going to happen. But because just so that I could look myself in the mirror in 6 months' time and know that even though they are caring for me full time or whatever the situation is, I played my part in trying to get better, and this was actually out of my hands. Granted, it was a silly mistake diving in the swimming pool, but I've done way, way sillier things that I should have broken my neck from. So it was, I do see it as, it's one of those freak accidents. So then I lay there and just spent every moment just concentrating on my toes, trying to move them, concentrating my hands, trying to move them. Very like Kill Bill-esque, if you've seen that film, it's kind
I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah. But after 2 days, nothing had happened. And I said I was going to do this for 6 months, but even after 2 days, you're like, is there any hope here? Until one day I opened my eyes. I was focusing on moving it, opened my eyes, and it was moving. First reaction was like, no, it can't be. Seeing things. Then I thought, okay, it must be a spasm, but it kept moving. And I just remember screaming for my mum to come in. And then obviously I just never wanted to stop moving it in case it went away again. But it proved that there was a connection past the level of injury. Like the surgeon was right to give me that prognosis, because that is purely based on the facts of the Asia tests. However, what had happened is my trauma had been so sort of severe on my spinal cord. Spinal shock is something your spinal cord does to protect itself when it's impacted quite hard. Normally it only lasts 24, 48 hours. Mine ended up lasting over a week. So actually I was still in spinal shock, rather than them being a full cross section of my cord that had died. So after 9 days, that started to wear off and revealed itself. And of course, that just gave me the hope, or the sort of motivation I needed to keep pushing. Now, we didn't know where it'd end up. I never imagined I would end up walking again, to be honest, at that point. If someone had offered me a wheelchair and to be independent, I would have bitten their hand off at that point. I mean, I'm glad they didn't, because now I am walking around. But it's it was that motivation to keep going. And the point up until then was despair mainly, and fear, like a lot of fear. You know, your identity's gone. You know, I was a sports person. I was known for my physicality and all of those things. And all of a sudden you're lying in bed, you can't even feed yourself, breathe for yourself, go to the toilet for yourself. And it was a scary place to be. But yeah, that wiggling toe changed my life. And it's funny thinking back how the bar shifts, how a wiggling toe can be the greatest thing you've ever experienced in terms of emotions, considering what had come before.
And what was going to sleep like? Because I often wonder whether in those moments, and you've been delivered this horrendous news, and like you say, there are flickers and moments of positivity around that, like the toe wiggling and things like that. When you go to sleep in those moments, and then when you wake up, do you wake up in this sort of, oh Christ, it's real again? You relive it every morning.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's like torture at the start, because it does feel like a nightmare. It does feel like this is the kind of thing that happens to someone else and not to you. And every time you wake up, and cruelly, you're still dreaming as if you're, you know, fully able. You're running around in your dreams, things haven't happened, then you wake up and you're like, wow, I am still in an intensive care unit. I've still got tubes down my throat. Like, what? And it is sort of reliving the trauma over and over again. And in time, that you come to terms with things. And it's funny, actually, how you wake up in the morning is kind of a good indicator of where your acceptance is, because there's conscious acceptance, but then there's also the subconscious acceptance of your body and your mind. And you know, are you still dreaming? As if I still have dreams now sometimes as if I'm able-bodied, but they never start off able-bodied. It's like, oh, I sort of break out, and then all of a sudden I can run again, which is quite cruel in itself. But I think I'm at a point of acceptance now, which that's absolutely fine, because I actually wouldn't go back and change things. And obviously we can chat about that in a bit. But it's at the time, you're very right. It's very good observation. It's really cruel, because you do wake up and relive the trauma almost every day, in that moment when you realize again and again and again that it's actually happened.
Do you struggle to go to sleep because you get to a bit, if you're progressing, you don't want that moment to end, like you said about the toe flicker. You sort of wanted to keep yourself awake, to keep checking and keep in touch with the fact that was real, that was happening.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I was quite fortunate that I had, because of being a rugby player before, I was actually quite contacted by quite a few people through like social media, and I started a blog online, and people who had been there before and were giving me advice. And it obviously, the doctors and nurses are giving you advice as well, but you want to attack it in a sort of professional athlete mindset. You don't want to just rest and wait there for all day for like half an hour of physio. You're like, what can I do now? And like, you know, keep pushing. But actually, a guy called David Smith, who's an ex-Paralympian, amazing guy, had been through something similar because he had a tumor in his spinal cord. He became a huge inspiration for me, and he's from a professional athletics background, and he was like, rest is as important. He was hammering it in from the start. He's like, rest is more important than the exercise you do. Like, you're trying to recover your neurology. So sleeping became part of the regime. It wasn't like something to shy away from. It was quite important. And I overdid it a few times for sure. But if you end up burnt out, that's only going to have a negative impact on a recovering sort of spinal cord. So it was very regimented. It was like entering pre-season again, but with unknown outcomes, because you just don't know how far you're going to get down the road and what the focus is going to be the next day. You've just got to try and control the controllables and keep going, which is great. I mean, I think people ask, if I think was beneficial that I was a professional rugby player and this happened to me, and of course, like, recovering from one of these things there's a lot of psychology involved, but it's basically doing hours and hours and days and months and years of physio. And that wasn't completely alien to me. This was my 8th operation, because rugby's a silly sport and you get injured a lot. And I'd spent months in rehab before. If recovering from this was spending days and days on spreadsheets, I'd probably still be in hospital, because that's alien to me, but someone else might find that easy. So of course that did play into my hands a little bit, for sure.
Yeah, and also the mindset of a professional athlete. I mean, like you say, you're used to routine, you're used to training, you're used to challenging your body in various different ways. But also the mindset's an interesting thing, isn't it? It's a real can-do attitude that a professional athlete has, and often, at many times, an attitude that others wouldn't share, because to get to where you want to get to requires real self-belief. So how much do you think that helped as well, not just from a physical standpoint, but also from a mental standpoint, and helping you get through those really hard, dark early days?
I think I don't know any different, right? I think it's what I'd done since I was at school. But when you research and you have lots of conversations and you reflect on the situations, like being a professional athlete, being involved in sport, as you know very well, is a roller coaster. It's not all highs; it's as many lows as well. And being able to manage the lows and the highs, so not get too carried away when you get results, but not get too low when you don't, gets you probably to the professional level, so that must be innately part of a lot of professional athletes anyway. But it's also something that's hammered into you, like, if we had a bad game on a Saturday, we had to get back up on a Monday and get ready and motivated for the weekend. We couldn't dwell on it. And also, if something didn't go right, you were sat in front of the rest of the team, and they were slow-moing it on video and pointing it out. So there's no shying away there's no hiding away from what the reality of the situation and what's going on. And I think also you understand deeply what you put in is what you get out. And even though it was uncertain what the outcomes would be, I knew that I didn't want to be in a position where I could look back and go, I could have done more, because that would have been tough to live with. So I just did everything I could. Now, you do everything you can, but then the other really important factor is your support network and the people around you. And I was very fortunate when I left intensive care. I went to the RUH in Bath as like a holding hospital before I went to Southmead to the spinal unit. And there's a physio there called Pete Bishop-Pont, and he's a really funny little, like, West Country, half Italian guy, but an absolute legend. And when I first saw him, I was very concerned, because I'd heard of this legendary Italian physio and I had an image in my mind, and Pete definitely wasn't that. But he's a magician. And the other thing is he's ex-army. So even though it wasn't probably protocol for the hospital for him to be setting me exercises to do, tying therabands to my bed, giving me broom poles and stuff, he knew he could challenge me. And if he told me to try and do 300 reps by the time he came back after lunch, I'd try and do 400, so those mindsets collided. I was very lucky that I wasn't in a situation where it was like, oh no, Ed, you can't do that. You might hurt yourself, or this might happen. And also very fortunate that I had my family in there every day. Lois, my partner, she's from a netball background. She understands. I had a lot of the rugby boys coming in. Whenever I could distract them from eating all of the snacks that I'd been brought as presents, they would help give me physio as well. So that whole sports community, not just the mindset, but the practicalities of having a support network as well, made a massive difference. Yeah.
How frustrated did you get, though, with progress? Because there's a long journey to go on, right? Between lying in a hospital bed with a spinal injury to walking up Snowdon. There's an awfully long journey to go on there, physically and mentally. And as a sports person, I'm guessing you're not the most patient person with wanting to meet your goals. So how did you learn to re-goal set effectively? Did you goal set? Or did you just, I don't know, how did you come to terms with that piece?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, because there isn't really that, you're never really sure of the outcome because it's open-ended. I
Yeah.
didn't know if all of a sudden my recovery would stop and I would be at that point then for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
And actually, at the beginning, I was started thinking, when I was using a wheelchair for the first time, I was like, maybe I can stand. And then you stand for the first time, you're like, maybe I can walk. But if you think too far ahead and set yourself as those being the goals, you just wake up frustrated every day because progression is so slow with
Yeah.
neurological injuries, and also it's not linear at all. One thing I did realize quite early on was my mindset was having a profound impact on my physical recovery. So when I was in a good headspace, I would see positive recovery in my neurology. This is getting now proven in the science, but at the
Mm.
time, like for me as a rugby player, I was like, that would seem woo-woo. Like, if you're in a positive headspace, why would that manifest itself physically in your body? But it really did. It was really clear to me. But the opposite would happen. When I was in a negative headspace, I would either plateau or go the other way. So I learned
Mm.
to really move my goals to daily small tasks, and achievable goals. So moving my third finger on my right hand another 3 centimeters or something would be the kind of goal I would think about. Not, okay, I'm still aiming to walk. That might happen in 6 months' time, but it's just going to frustrate me. And it was those micro goal setting, which I know is a well practiced thing in sport. But I had to ignore the end outcome, and just focus on what I could do every day to try and take a little step forward. Because when I achieved that little goal, it put me in a better headspace because I'd had a win that day. And then conversely, like that would all, transpire into more physical recovery and snowball. And you've almost got to forget about the outcome. It's fine to have the dream, and to think about it every now and again, but not set your mind on that, goal that may or may not happen. That's effectively out of your hands because you'll be detracting away from what you could do in the moment on the day.
So when did you first start dreaming of walking, and then that actually happened? When did you take that first step?
So I took the first step on my last day at Salisbury Spinal Unit, because it turned out to be my last day because I took a step and I was like, right, get me out of here. So, um, I could actually only walk backwards for a bit, and in parallel bars with people holding my leg. So it wasn't, by all means, it wasn't walking as such. And actually, a lot of wheelchair users can use their legs. They can stand, they can take some steps. So it didn't mean that I was going to be a walker, in inverted commas, as we call them in the spinal cord injury community. Sounds like something out of a horror film, but um, I that was the point when I thought, okay, now I want to be back on my feet. And there was actually, it was probably a bit before that. I remember when I got stood up in a standing frame for the first time, which can basically stand people up who can't stand at all, because it puts some weight behind your legs and in front of your knees and sort of mechanically lifts you up. And that was the first time I'd been vertical, if you like, for months, which was a bit of a shock to the physios and the nurses because I'm 6'4", but I'd been lying down or sat down and looking up their nose for the light. So they were a bit surprised how tall I was. I was a bit surprised how short they were. But I remember, the reason the physio, Kim, who was another amazing physio I had at Salisbury, did that is because she wanted me to see life through these eyes again. Like, it's very easy, to become accustomed to your situation, which actually is a very useful tool in a lot of situations for the human mind, to get to that point of acceptance. But I was quite happy bombing around in my wheelchair, and actually she was like, no, we need to push on to the next stage. So let's stand you up. Let's make you feel like you want to be tall again. And it worked. That's when I moved that dream on a bit further. Right, what are my daily practices to try and get to that next step?
And so from there, mountains. And so the film that you've got out is amazing. It's the mountain within me. And obviously that is a metaphor for many things. But then fundamentally also, you are now taking on these huge challenges. We'll talk in a minute about how Lois, your poor, beautiful wife, copes with the demands of those challenges. But what did you decide you wanted to do, and when? And why is taking on these mountains the challenge for you?
Um, it wasn't like a moment where I was like, okay, this is what I want to do. As I said, I climbed Snowdon after a year, and the main aim behind that was to fundraise for one of the charities that supported me, Restart, which look after the rugby players the pro rugby players in England. But also I wanted to try and send a message to anyone else in hospital, that just because they'd been given a negative prognosis does not necessarily mean that has to be the case. No, caveat to that is it might be the case, because you can only recover to within the scope of your own injury. And if I did have a complete spinal cord injury, doesn't matter how hard I would have tried, I wouldn't have recovered further than that. And I know a lot of people who work a lot harder than me, but their injuries limit them further behind. So that's the caveat. But I know there are a lot of people who've been given that guarded negative prognosis that probably, why wouldn't they believe it? So I wanted to send that message, but it was actually in the process of climbing Snowdon, because I've been up there before, but I've been up there as training, with rugby. And, Snowdon is a mountain, but realistically, to someone who's really fit, it's a hill, it's a nice day out. But for me, it felt like a mountain that day. It took 9 hours, and I opened it up on social media to anyone who wanted to come. And unbelievably, there was like 70 people who came to support, people I didn't know. And it was the first time since my accident that I had felt any sort of sense of purpose again. Anything like that, something good was coming from this, what was a terrible situation at the time. The conversations I was having, people saying, it's great, you've inspired me to get out and do this, and through my own troubles, and in the same way I was inspired by other people like David Smith and loads of others, actually, Matt Hampson, to name just a few. And I was like, okay, there's something in this. So I felt this massive sense of sort of purpose and achievement and reward and positivity. And I think I basically said to myself in my head then, like, if enough positives can come out of this situation for other people, then by definition, I can change it from a bad day when I dived in the pool to a good day, literally by definition. So I set out on that journey. And at the same time as climbing these mountains, so I wanted to go higher. I went to the Alps, climbed Mont Bouet a few months later, and then went higher and higher and higher, found myself in Nepal. At the same time I was doing this and healing myself, I suppose, from being outdoors, challenging myself, I don't want to say proving people wrong, but I still had in the back of my head that I was told I was never going to walk again. And that was motivating me. I was like, okay, you were walking again, but let's see what else you can do. It was also motivating me to carry on with my rehab and my physio, because I didn't have those rugby games anymore, those points in the diary where, I'm sure for Ben, he's got an America's Cup coming up, all of a sudden training ramps up and it's easy for him to go to the gym because there's something. I didn't have that. It was open-ended. So I was setting myself these challenges that I wouldn't have been able to climb in my current state in a year's time or 6 months' time. But I know that if I train to get myself to a certain point, I will. So there was a personal reason behind it as well. But I also wanted to take people with me because I was realizing the rewards. And so the charity was sort of formed and founded, Millimetres to Mountains, to take other people who've been through trauma, young adults, on these expeditions up these mountains, whether it's physical or psychological trauma, get them out their comfort zone, make them realize they're more capable than they thought they were, but more importantly, create a community of compatriots who have been through something similar, even if it's not exactly the same trauma. They get together, become friends, they share their situations, and then we put plans in place for them to sort of move forward. And it's that, for me, gives me an unbelievable sense of purpose. What we've done with the charity means that I do not regret my accident at all.
Yeah.
So, mountains seem to be the sort of arena for it all. And yes, I do still take on some pretty tough individual challenges, but actually it's the community, the sense of purpose, the paying the help forward that I received. That's what's really been the sort of healing thing for me.
And lots of people go through their lives and have at one moment or another an identity crisis. I mean, that happens to people all the time. Has this given you your identity back, your sense of identity? Because I know purpose is one thing, but it is all about as well who you believe you are as a person, right?
Yeah. I've been forced into that, and I think I'm very grateful for it, because I felt like I was Ed the rugby player. And that was who I was. And, you know, I had one eye on the end of my career already because, you know, I was getting to my late 20s and I was already scared of what I would do next, like many sports people are. It's like, well, this is who I am. You know, this is what everyone knows me for. Can I? Of course you can. Of course you do have the skills to move into move into a lot of different arenas, but you don't feel like that if it's the only thing you've ever done from a young age. But having everything sort of wiped back, the slate cleaned and everything wiped back to zero, and lying on my back, you know, not unable to move, it made me question, like, right, who really are you? Like, what do you enjoy? What do you want to do? What are you going to be able to? You don't know. And I've gone on this journey since that day, not being able to do anything that I thought my identity was wrapped up in before, and having to build a life literally by following my heart, following my gut. I have the confidence that it can all end tomorrow. It's quite a sort of powerful sort of staring death in the face is quite a powerful tool or motivator to say yes to things and take chances and think what's the worst that can happen. And there has been no plan, but I've ended up in a place where I'm surrounded by amazing people doing things that I love and I feel more passionate about than I ever have. And none of the things I do now I would ever have considered I would do before my accident or were capable of doing. And that's the irony, you know, the irony is that's all come from the worst moment of my life. But actually it was probably the biggest gift of my life because I feel more aligned with who I am than ever. And I realize now I was never Ed the rugby player. I was just Ed who played rugby. Now I'm sort of Ed that does lots of other weird and wonderful things.
And you're clearly a super brave person. I mean, you chose rugby as your first career, so that, you know, that obviously lends to that theory in the first place. But having gone through what you've gone through, does anything scare you anymore? Are you afraid of death, or are you afraid when you go up those mountains? I mean, does anything frighten you anymore? Does it make you feel like there's an invincibility around you now because you've been able to come through what you've come through?
Yes and no. I think I probably did feel a bit more invincible than I did as a rugby player. However, yeah, of course I still get scared of things. You know, in the film, there's, you know, a moment where quite a big moment where we nearly die in the pool effectively. I won't go into much more detail than that, but that was a big reset and a big sort of shot across the bow of like, I was sat there thinking this on the side of a mountain in the Himalayas at 6,000 meters, and as dark was falling, no tents, no food, no water, not knowing you're going to see the next day, thinking, I really don't want to die. It's like, I quite like my life actually, and I've got things to do and people that I love, and it was kind of a powerful feeling and obviously a big motivator to get through that situation. So yes, there is a bit of an air of invincibility of like, I feel like I'm quite hard to kill because I've tried quite a lot my whole life. But at the same time, my life's more important to me now than it was, I think, especially, you know, with Lois and my family, but also all of the beneficiaries of the charity that are really important to me. And that I do think about that quite a lot. However, I like to use the term, so we heard this term. I did a crossing of an ice cap in Iceland last year with two other guys with spinal cord injuries, and we went and met with ISAR, who are Iceland Search and Rescue. And whenever there's a global sort of natural disaster, whatever there might be, all of the search and rescue units from around the world go there, an earthquake, and ISAR are always in charge. They're like the top dogs when it comes to this. And we went and told them what we were doing so they could track us and all of these things. And I thought, oh God, we're gonna get in trouble. Or they're not. The look on their face is gonna be interesting when there's me, another very wobbly guy, and a guy in a wheelchair on a sit ski about to cross Vatnajökull, which is a serious ice cap. But they said no. They said, you've done the right thing, come and speak to us. But also, what is life without risk? And they said, as long as it's risky and not reckless. So that's the kind of thing I keep in my mind when I take on these challenges. Obviously, things can change and, you know, unforeseen events can happen, but you could get hit by a bus crossing the road tomorrow. You know, I broke my neck diving into the wrong end of a swimming pool, although I played professional rugby for 10 years, tackling 20-stone Tongans. Like, it's just, you can wrap yourself in cotton wool, but at the same time, when you do get a shot across the bow like I did in the pool, it does sort of reframe your thinking about what I should be doing and how I should be doing it. So risky, not reckless is kind of my mantra when I want to take on these challenges.
And what about Lois? Because she's been obviously the most amazing support to you and been behind you every single literal step of the way in what you've been doing subsequently since everything happened. We talk about teamwork, don't we? But, in professional sport, but this is teamwork, isn't it? Of the highest possible order.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't want to say I'm nothing without her, but I'm definitely a very, very depleted version of myself. We are, yeah, we do come as a pair, and I actually can't imagine going through what I went through without her or without someone, without someone to not just be there in a practical sense, but the motivation she gave me to want to give us some life back. If it was just me and it was just going to affect me, I don't know if I would have found the strength to really push through those important bits. But she's so stoic. She's like, she was amazing through the whole process. She still is amazing to this day, of course. This has brought us a lot closer together. It was challenging, of course, at times. Initially I was like, you need to leave me. Like, you didn't sign up for this. But of course, after she told me to shut up and get on with it, it's been, yeah, I feel very fortunate to have her. And I think, like, the other thing that you realize when something like this happens is it readdresses, it gives you a different perspective on what is important to you in life and your relationships, probably sometimes that you take for granted, whether that be your friends, your family, your partner. When you're lying there and everything else has been taken away and you look around your bed and they're the people still there, they're the constant, they're not going anywhere, that's not going to change. It does readdress, how important they are and how much effort you should put into those sorts of things, and how lucky you are to have those people there in the first place, because not everyone does, which was quite a surprising realization for me when I spent 4 months on the spinal unit. I had a room full of people most days. Some people didn't have any visitors for 3 months, which is, a terrifying thought.
So sad.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's really sad. And then in terms of what's happening next for you, what is next? Because you must now be starting to, I know you don't dare to dream too much, but what might be the next challenge? What might be the next undertaking? I've
just finished my big climb of this year, which I climbed the Matterhorn a couple of weeks ago, which was an amazing sort of feat for me. It was something I'd been dreaming of for quite a long time, and I didn't know if it was going to be physically possible. I think I'm still, as you can see, I've still got scabs on my fingers from the Matterhorn. So thinking about the next mountain at the moment is quite difficult. Give me a few more days and I'm sure my mind will move on to it, but I'm quite enjoying a sit down. I'd like to go to Kyrgyzstan next year and climb an unclimbed peak. So do a first ascent with a team of people with disabilities. So claim the first ascent for a disabled team would be pretty cool, but it's still very much in planning stages.
Ed, what does it take out of you when you've done a climb like that? Like you say, like we could see on your hands, obviously various calluses from climbing. But how long does it take to rebuild? I mean, for somebody who doesn't have these injuries, it takes a while to get back to where they want to be after a climb like that. But for you, what does it take?
It depends on how full on the climb's been, I suppose. But it takes a while. I need to do a lot more care in terms of stretching, recovery, rest. I'm not very good at resting. I never have been. But I think there's a combined thing of obviously my spinal cord injury, but just getting older as well. It's like I'm not 25 anymore. So I like to blame my spinal cord injury, but I think some of it might be the fact that I'm sort of creeping towards 40, but we'll see. In the moment, in the challenges, I have to think about my body very differently. I have to prep very differently. I have to recover very differently and more focus on it. I can't just push through the whole time because sometimes my body will just give up on me. Having said that, I've realized now like how much of it is psychological and how far you can push your body, even compared to what I thought before as a professional sportsman. When I was in pre-season and we were me and Rain to run up hills until we were sick and stuff like that, I thought that was the max. But when your back's against the wall and your life's on the line and whether you're going to walk again or not, you realize how much further you can dig. And I utilize that in the challenges and then kind of just come home, lick my wounds and deal with the consequences after. And try and make Lois look after me, but she doesn't have any sympathy anymore. So it's kind of down to me.
Oh, you're lucky to have her. You really are.
Yeah.
Ed, it's been so lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much. It's been fascinating.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Join us for the Performance People podcast every week for the highs, lows, lessons and stories from people like this lot. Michael Johnson.
Some days what I would see is a person who is a shell of what I used to be.
Eddie Hearn.
We don't operate in a business that's dangerous, but we just operate in one where you've got to sleep with one eye open.
Mo Farah.
It couldn't get any harder than what I've gone through, and at that point I just went for it.
Paula Radcliffe.
You can only control yourself.
Susie Wolf.
And Toto did once liken me to a donkey.
Every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts.